Farm plans and the layout are very important before the actual production takes place. They should be carefully studied and interpreted before implementing the planting system. Proper planting is usually based on farm plan. However, in some instances, planting system is followed according to approved cultural practices. An on-site assessment of farm is necessary so that a map of the property's topography, boundaries, soil, water resources can be drawn, hence a farm business can be formulated. For this week, we will be dealing with interpreting farm plans and layout. Our objectives are to lay out garden plots, of course, to design farm plans and layouts according to crop growth, and of course, to follow strictly planting system and practices according to approved cultural practices. Class, a whole farm plan considers the farm's physical, financial, and human or personal resources for the present and the future. Okay, so let's deal with the different crop arrangement. Crop arrangement helps to battle against the forces of erosion. So rotating crops helps to improve soil stability by alternating between crops with deep roots and those with shallow roots. Also, pests are deterred by eliminating their food source on a regular basis. Class, we have here the different crop arrangement. For the first one, we have the row planting, the spatial arrangement, and the multiple row planting. For the first one class, we have the row planting. The row planting as applied in conventional horizontal farming or gardening is a system of growing crops in linear pattern in at least one direction rather than planting without any distinct arrangement. It is practiced in most crops, whether direct seeded, transplanted, or grown from vegetative planting materials, both in monocropping and multiple cropping. Class in row planting, okay? Crops are planted in rows or straight lines, either singly or in multiple rows, mainly to enhance maximum yields as well as for convenience. So for row planting, an east-west row orientation is preferred to maximize light absorption, but this is not always possible, class. In many cases, the topography that includes the shape, terrain, and slope of the land as well as the location of existing vegetation routes, irrigation lines, buildings, and physical barriers dictate the row orientation. So class, let's watch this short video.
In our Farm Basics time today, we're going to talk about row spacing. Why do some farmers have wide rows and others have narrow rows?
All right, first of all, this is not the difference between 500 bushel corn and 200 bushel corn. Just switching a row spacing doesn't make that much difference for farmers, but it does make a significant difference when you look at the equipment that's going to be used out in the field, and also as you move further north in the country, when you have a shorter growing season. Filling in those rows quicker to catch all the sunlight is easier to accomplish with narrow rows.
All right, but here's the thing. There are a lot of different crops. And let's say that a farmer wants to raise 3 or 4 or 5 different crops. Well, is he going to match up row spacing with every single one of those crops? Maybe or maybe not. So let's take soybeans, for example, on our farm. We plant most of our beans now in 30-inch rows. Part of the reason why we don't plant them in 10-inch rows or 7-inch rows and what we would call very narrow rows is because we have a lot more disease pressure. When the rows are close together, then basically what ends up happening is more moisture is trapped in those rows. There's more humidity there. There's more likelihood of disease issues. And in our operation, we have a major problem with sclerotinia white mold and other soybean diseases, so we don't like narrow rows for soybeans.
Well, in corn, it really changes things when you go to these narrow row spacings about how the corn plants are going to be spaced out in the field. A lot of farmers think as they get to higher populations that, you know what, narrow rows are kind of nice because I can leave more space in between the plants, versus when I'm in a wide row trying to slam a lot of plants per acre out there, they've got to be really pretty close together. I do see the merit to that, there's no question about that, but there are some challenges with narrow rows as well, with stock quality and how they're going to stand out in the field. So there are some trade-offs there for farmers to consider if they look at different row spacings in corn.
Now let's turn to wheat, for example. If you were going to put wheat in 30-inch rows, you probably wouldn't raise a lot of wheat. Wheat is a much shorter plant than corn, and to some degree soybeans as well. So when you've got that short plant, you're not going to capture enough sunlight. You're not going to shade the row in, and if you don't capture the sunlight, obviously you've lost yield. If you don't shade the row in, you're going to have a lot more weeds. So there are a lot of disadvantages to wide rows when it comes to a short stature plant like wheat.
Well, unfortunately, if there are some benefits to one row spacing versus another, farmers really have to choose. They can't just switch up all their equipment to move from one to the other. They can't switch the widths of their tires and these kinds of things. So farmers really do pick one system and try and stay with it.
Well, yeah, but Darren, they will plant multiple crops. Like even on our farm, we do raise some wheat. Okay, well, we have to have different equipment for that versus the corn or soybean equipment. So that's the whole thing that Darren's getting at here.
It just adds a lot more expense.
Exactly. So there are many reasons why farmers will go to narrow rows versus wide rows, or the other way around. I mean, we look at wide rows on our farm as a big advantage, but some people think it's a big disadvantage. So it all depends on that farmer, his ground, his situation, and the crops he's raising.
Just a reminder, class, in single row planting, it requires a wide area to establish uniform rows. The space between the rows needed to be of equal distance. The size of the plant, tree, or vegetable determines the distance between the seeds and between the rows. As a general rule, class, the bigger the plants, the bigger the space needed in between rows. The soil is mounded and hoed in straight line. Class, here are the specific advantages of row planting over broadcasting or scatter planting. Okay, so for the first one, of course, light absorption is maximized, and conversely, the excessive shading effect of other plants is minimized, thus favoring more efficient photosynthesis and improved crop yield. For the second one, we have, of course, the wind passage along the interrows is enhanced, which increases, of course, gas exchanges and prevents excessive humidity. Okay, the third one is the access through the interrows facilitates cultivation, weeding, and the other farm operations, including hauling. Okay, for the last one, okay, the movement within the crop area is convenient and allows close inspection of individual plants. Class row planted crops are either arranged in equidistant single rows or in multiple rows. Planting in single rows is most common in monocropping or sole cropping, the growing of a single crop. Class, different systems of planting arrangement within the row are practiced in both single and multiple row planting, depending of course on the characteristics and requirement of the crop, particularly its extent of canopy expansion. So in the hill method of planting crops by direct seeding, the crops are arranged singly or in group, in uniform distances. But in the drill method, the only consideration is a uniform number of plants per linear meter. We proceed to the multiple row planting. So multiple row planting is a system of growing crops in blocks or strips of two or more rows. The adjacent blocks are separated by space which may remain vacant or planted to other crops. This planting arrangement is common in multiple cropping, in which two or more crops are grown in the same piece of land. It is also employed in monocropping, where an alley wide enough to facilitate passage is needed. Coconut and other perennial crops are often intercrop class, okay, with multiple rows of annual crops like corn and pineapple. This is a common practice of maximizing the use of vacant inter-row spaces when the main crop has not fully developed, thus allowing sufficient light exposure. In some farms class, the intercrop consists of multiple rows of such crops as coffee, cacao, and banana. In this system class, both single row planting for the main crop and the multiple row planting for the intercrop are combined. Class B are reminded that in vegetable production that employs close spacing and where crops should be within easy reach, the common practice is to plant in plots having multiple rows. So a space between plots is provided, of course, to allow passage. Class, we have the third one, the spatial arrangement in intercropping. Spatial arrangement is the systematic apportioning of the farm area or any growing surface for crop production. Class in multiple cropping, by intercropping, the intercrop can be planted in any of the following ways: within the rows of the main crop, between the rows of the main crop, and of course in replacement series. For the first one, we have within the rows of the main crop. Planting of the intercrop between two adjacent hills within the same row of the main crop allows inter-row cultivation class, but the intercrop has limited exposure to sunlight, of course. So this is exemplified by the planting of peanut or mung bean between corn plants within the same row, or two coffee plants that are 3 meters apart between coconut plants. Second, we have between the rows of the main crop. Single row planting of the intercrop can also be done between two rows of the main crop. For example, class, peanut or mung bean can be devolved between two adjacent rows of corn. So this system of planting arrangement is likewise common in coconut farms where fruit trees like durian, lanzones, and mangosteen are grown in single rows between coconut. Class, let's proceed to replacement series. So class, in replacement series, one or more rows that are intended for the main crop are replaced with the intercrop. So for example, a 3:2 corn plus mung bean intercrop. Okay, it means that class, for every 4 rows that are intended for only one corn or sole corn, only 3 rows are planted to corn and one row may be substituted with 2 rows of mung bean. Now class, let's proceed to the two methods of planting crops. We have the direct seeding or direct sowing. The second one is of course transplanting. Direct seeding or direct sowing class is a method of planting which seeds are directly planted on the ground in the farm or growing surface. So it is either by broadcast, heel, drill, or dipple methods. It generally appears to large seeding vegetables as well as cereals and grain legumes. Class transplanting make use of pre-grown plants, seedling, and vegetatively propagated ones. The term is also used to refer to the practice of replanting an established plant in one location and moving it elsewhere. So transplanting is most common with the small seeded vegetables, vegetatively propagated crops, okay, ornamental, fruit trees, and many perennial crops. Class, here are the other methods of planting crops. For the first one, we have the broadcasting, commonly known as the sabog tanim. For the second one, we have the heel method. Third one, we have the drill method. And for the last one, we have the slashing and burning. Planting crops class by broadcasting or scatter planting, also known as sabog tanim, commonly applies to small seeds like rice and mungo. There is no control of plant-to-plant spacing class. So with hand broadcasting, a volume of seeds is held by the hand and thrown. Class in the hill and drill methods of planting crops by direct seeding, there is a desired row-to-row spacing. Hills with single or multiple numbers of plants are spaced uniformly within each row. So in contrast class, there is no uniform spacing between plants in the drill method, but uniformity in number of plants per linear meter is of course intended. The hill method of direct seeding is done by dropping seeds in holes made by a tippler or in furrows that are more or less equidistant. Class the drill method of planting crops is done either manually or mechanically by releasing seeds continuously as if pouring from bottle with a small opening. The seeds are drilled with or without furrows. Just like in the hill method of planting crops, an even distribution of drilled seeds is intended but varies with seeding rate per hectare and row distance. Slashing and burning class are done during summer when grasses are dry, with the dibbler class a pointed spear-like stem or what we call in Tagalog class the panghaso, held by one hand strikes the ground to make holes about 2 inches or 5 centimeters deep and 1 to 2 steps apart. So as the pointed tip of the dibbler is lifted, someone immediately drops 3 to 4 seeds into the hole. Class, let's proceed to the best practice or guidelines for a vegetable farm. First, you should plan the best farm layout. Check the market thoroughly before committing any finances to an enterprise. Have a business plan class. Financial and market analysis are the key steps to profitability. Next, acquaint yourself with the relevant environmental plans and their effects on your proposed or existing farm enterprise. And for the last one, consider what type of irrigation system best fits the land's topography. Time for challenge class. So let's reflect. As a student, family member, and responsible citizen, rethink of how can you help Filipino farmers even in small ways. Again, let's reflect class. As a student, family member, and responsible citizen, rethink of how can you help Filipino farmers even in small ways. Class, do you have any questions? Feel free to send me a message and your concern via Messenger. Thank you and goodbye.